Greetings sailors and welcome back to World of Warships and a look at the newly released ORP Orkan, which is an interesting ship. I use interesting in a good sense because it has one particularly powerful gimmick and some real drawbacks to go along with that gimmick, but it feels like a relatively balanced ship. It's also maybe a bit of a niche ship as well. Now, both games I'm going to show you are me playing solo, but I'll say right at the start, this seems like the kind of ship that would go really well as part of a division, possibly of destroyers, or maybe along with a cruiser of some kind, because, as you will have no doubt noticed, this is packing a radar, and it's the only Tier 8 destroyer to do so. Now, at Tier 9 and Tier 10 it's a little bit more common. You've got the Black, you've got the Smerland, and of course you have the option on the two British, the Royal Navy destroyers in place of smoke, but this doesn't have smoke, being a European destroyer, and so although this is a Polish ship, it has a lot more in line with the rest of the recently introduced Europeans than the pre-existing one that was transferred into the European tree, the Wiscowice, which really does kind of stick out as a bit of a non-conformist, shall we say, on that line. It really doesn't share any commonalities at all. This does share a few commonalities with some other ships though, and that is principally because this is basically an L-class destroyer, and we have one of those in-game already in the form of the Lightning. It does, however, have exactly the same torpedoes as the Erland, and only one set of them, so it's a kind of weird mix of ships. It's a Lightning. I mean, the guns are basically identical. I think the shells do very slightly more damage, so it theoretically has a slightly higher DPM than Lightning, but yeah, it's got the exact same reload. I think the range is a little bit different between them, but yeah, everything else is the same. Turret traverse is the same. It's got pretty much the same hit points as the Lightning. It's very slightly different. It's out by like 100, although of course this does have that pan-European heal, and it's got those 4 torps that, well, Cossack actually has, you know, that setup with only 4 torpedoes, but Cossack's torps are rather more powerful, although they are shorter ranged and a lot slower. So it's essentially a mashup, if you like, between the European ships and the British destroyers, whereas Wiscowice is much more in line with the British destroyers overall. So what you have is quite a specialised ship, and it really is all because of that radar. You've sacrificed a reasonable amount for it. I mean, the rate of fire isn't brilliant for the tier anyway, but compared to Lightning it's rather less stealthy, which is a good thing. I mean, Lightning you can get down to about 5.5. This, when we were testing it initially, could get down to about 5.7, and I personally found it was kind of overpowered given that it had a radar. It was rather too effective at ambushing other destroyers. It's now 5.9, which is still reasonable, but there are a lot more destroyers that can now outspot you, especially higher tier ones. 5.7 actually gave you an advantage over quite a few higher tier destroyers as well. So you can still be well within your radar range of 7.5 kilometers, and you know, if you get spotted by something that outspots you, you can just instantly ping that radar, which runs for a default of 20 seconds, but in this case I've got the module on that gives me an extra 20%, so it runs for 24 seconds. And you can use it in that kind of reactive way, but more the strength of this ship is being proactive in this sort of game where there are cap circles, although I'm not really going to use it in that way. In fact, you'll see me use it a bit in that way in the next game, but neither of the games I've picked out really show that to its fullest potential, as it were. Because that really is what this specialises in, is being able to have that reasonable stealth and radar people as they're trying to cap. And even if you don't necessarily do much damage or get a kill, you can sometimes, even just by the act of radaring somebody, scare them off long enough for yourselves to get the cap and make enemy destroyers nearby wary about trying again because they know there's a radar in play. But you do need backup for that. Trying to do that all on your own is not a great idea. It's the exact same guns, as I said, as the Lightning. So you've got 6 twin turret 120mm with, by default, a 4.5 second reload. This captain has BFT, and I'll show you the captain skills I used at the end. But it's essentially the same captain setup as I have on my Erland, except replacing the torpedo reload skill for BFT, because there aren't really any of the other tier 4 skills that could be useful. Although, having said that, radio location could potentially be very useful on this ship as a radar ship, so you might want to do a captain setup that involves that. Personally, I don't really play a lot of ships with radio location, but that's personal preference. I know some people do, and this is certainly a good ship to consider that for. So outside of that ambush role, that cap contesting role, what you can do is rather more limited. You do have decent firepower, but you don't have smoke to use. You don't have those... I mean, even the Lightning only has the short duration smokes, but you can place them down strategically and use them to get off short bursts of damage. But in this case, you really are either firing at other destroyers or trying to use allied smoke, or sometimes just doing opportunistic damage against players that are otherwise distracted. And you'll see a bit of that in the next replay. But in this case, I don't really feel like opening fire, because that's a Des Moines who has actually radared me already. I caught the edge of their radar earlier, so I know they probably do have some left, but they're a bit distracted at the moment. And this is why I'm skirting around this cap circle. I'm debating whether to signal that I am here, and if nothing else, there is a midway in play in this game, and that leads me on to talking about another aspect of this ship, which is the AA, which isn't very good. It's way better than the Cossack, because Cossack has terrible AA, although much better firepower. But it is actually a bit worse than the Lightning. Not a huge amount. It's got about half of the mid-range DPS, something like that. But because of this funny setup with the torpedoes, you actually have, in place of one of the torpedo tubes on the Lightning, instead a 102mm gun, which acts as a secondary. Not secondary, dual purpose. Well, it is a secondary gun, but it's a dual purpose gun as well. It's actually got a 5-kilometer range on it, so, you know, it's one of those very rare destroyers where you could, in theory, do a secondary setup, but why would you? It's a single gun. But the extra boost it gives to your long-range AA means that, yeah, this does have better long-range AA than the Lightning in terms of flak bursts and slightly more DPS, but that lack of closer range DPS means that you're probably overall not going to shoot down as many planes. The carrier in this game, you know, I got lucky. The carrier in this game could have made life so much harder for me. Rocket planes from the Midway could easily have killed me without too much difficulty, and there's not a lot I could have done about it. In an Erland, I would have been a lot more confident, comfortable, even in a tier 10 game, because the Erland's AA does hold up reasonably well, and you've got the defensive as well, of course. And one of the reasons why the European destroyers overall are so strong in the AA role is partly the destroyer stealth that you get, because you can just open up at that point where they are over your mid and short range AA already, and they can't really do a lot about it. So you're basically getting the maximum possible boost out of your AA. And if you compare that to, say, something like, well, a good example is the upcoming California. Don't ask me when it's upcoming, I have no idea. But that, in theory, also has very good AA. Exceptional AA for a tier 7 battleship. But that AA is, again, all in the mid and short range. and it's not like you can be sneaky and wait until you're only just air detected to open up your AA guns, because it's a battleship. You don't have that option. So instead you have far more of planes milling around in your outer AA envelope with all the flak, and that's rather less effective. That's not where the strong AA is on the California. So that was a little aside that really didn't have much to, that was more to do with European destroyers generally. But like I said, this doesn't really fit in. You've got that 102, that 4-inch secondary gun, but you've only got about half of the 20mm Oerlikons that Lightning has. So that's why there's that big difference. So yeah, that's definitely a weakness of this ship. Not that it's a particular strength for the Lightning, but you compare it to the Erland, it's definitely a weakness. And so down tier games like this, you really are at the mercy of whether the carrier decides to come for you or not. And in this case, they didn't, which was nice for me, because I wouldn't have been able to do a lot about it. This has come down to being rather a close game. I mean, I was able to sneak around and get crucially take out that Des Moines. I think that was a rather useful moment. Then I was able to kill that Shima, which was a handy use of the radar, and just about my only use of the radar in this game. I didn't have a lot of counter DD play in this one. And well, then there's just the Sovietsky Soyuz left, but we're ahead on points, and I deemed it more important to get caps, especially as I'm not convinced this Yamato is going to survive. The team has not been terribly complimentary about them in chat, although they're actually going to do alright on the score screen. But you'll notice, yeah, they're firing quite a bit of HE. They've been certainly firing HE before this point. I don't know if they've been exclusively firing HP. HE even, because yeah, they'll be like second or third on the score screen, and so they must have fired some AP at some point, but not that I saw them. Little boop there. I'm trying to get past so I can get to the decap, and we know their carrier is over there at this point as well. Clearly their carrier's been spotted, because you'll see in a moment they don't have a lot of hit points, so there's maybe even a chance I might get to do some extra damage out of the carrier. But for the most part, damage wise, this has not been a particularly spectacular game, not even remotely. So we've skipped ahead again a little bit. Both of these replays are going to be pretty heavily edited. There weren't really that many patches of continuous action. I will say, quite honestly, prior to it coming out just now, I didn't play it that much when it was being tested previously with the better stealth. I don't know if anything else changed. I honestly can't remember offhand. The stealth value is the one that sticks in mind. But yeah, having just played a bunch of battles today, it's been a slightly weird staccato experience almost. Just because you don't have those periods of being able to do sustained damage. I mean, yes, you've got more guns than the Erland does. You've actually got a better range than the Erland does, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. Good in that, you can hit targets further away, but bad in that it's then harder to drop off into stealth again after you've been engaging with somebody, which is actually one of the nice features I find of the European destroyers, the Swedish ones, is that you can easily disengage. You can just set your course away and get away that bit quicker. But yeah, otherwise it doesn't feel like quite the gunboat, because even though it's got two more guns than Erland just fires that much quicker. But you will have seen there at least that the firing angles when you're going forwards are good, just like the Lightning. It's less good when you're going away from somebody, because you've only then got the one rear turret available. But when you're heading towards somebody, it's got those quite nice British destroyer angles working for it, and you will see that again in the next replay. So easily top of the team, 2.3k damage, even though damage XP, even though I really did barely any damage. So I don't know if this is representative at all, but it's been quite like that for a few of my games. Top tier, bottom tier, I don't get a lot of damage, and I have these games where there are these long stretches of inactivity, or just periods when I'm not able to do much. But at the same time, I'm still managing really good scores for a destroyer. Part of it was the last game being a tier 10, and this is again a tier 10, and doing things like damaging the Des Moines and damaging the Shima, even though I didn't get the kill. That certainly helps. But I think it's just also partly its role, or what I perceive its role to be, in that you are this ambush specialist, and that you will be mostly firing your guns against other destroyers. I mean, in this case, for instance, I've got the Erland with me. So I was quite confidently able to come in against the kid who had, I think, slightly better detection than I did, but between the pair of us and between me getting in that torpedo hit, and because they're the exact same torpedoes as the Erland has, you can get them up to, was it almost 80 knots? So, kind of hard to dodge. We have to, all that in mind, we have to remember that absolute damage numbers aren't everything. It's not a linear relation between damage and XP in this game. It's the percentage of somebody's hit points that you've taken off. And so this is why, and I mention this from time to time, but it's worth repeating from time to time because not everybody's going to know it. It's useful to remind everybody that destroyers, things with lower hit points, are worth more for the same value of damage, because you can much more easily take off a higher percentage of their health for any given shot. A single overpen on a battleship at high tiers, it might be 1,000 damage out of somebody with 100,000 hit points, which is barely any of their hit points. Whereas if you're taking that chunk out of somebody with 20,000 hit points, that's a much bigger percentage. So even though the damage numbers on this ship I don't think are ever going to be impressive particularly, and yeah, this is going to be a moment of classic Jedi derp coming up. It doesn't necessarily translate to bad scores because of the nature of your role. The fact that you are so often fighting other destroyers and contesting against other destroyers and doing damage against other destroyers. Although in this case, I was trying to be cheeky and thinking I'd fire off a few shots at the Moskva as I went around the corner, and instead slammed into the island. Well done me. That is precisely why I wasn't going into the cap, though, and why I was taking this more circuitous route around to the other flank, because I know there's a Moskva there and he'd just radar me if I tried to actually cap. As to why I was going over on the other side, well, both our destroyers, there are only 2 in this game per side, were in that cap, and one of the enemy destroyers, another Erland, was over on this side. But by the time I got over here, in fact even before I got here, they died already. But there are still some nice fat hit pointy battleships for me to try and do something against. So again, this is something you will get to do sometimes, and this is going to be a better damage game in terms of absolute numbers overall, just because I was then in a position to do this. But the Erland would have been better placed just because it's got 2 more torpedoes available. And certainly the Lightning would have been better placed with its better stealth and better torpedoes as well, and the ability to sit and smoke and just ping away without worrying about getting shot at. I mean, I could open fire right now, but it would be a pretty damn risky thing to do. Both of these battleships might decide that a destroyer at closer range is a much tastier target than these battleships behind me, just because it's worth more in terms of XP, as I've said. The torp reload is, though, fairly quick, just like the other, well, most of the other European destroyers. I think it clocks in at 70 seconds, which is a little slower than Cossack, I think. And I think under these circumstances, actually, Cossack would have been, like this specific, thing I'm doing right now, Cossack would have been better, because I could be just as close to have the smoke available to do the pew-pews. I'd have still only 4 torps, but I could do single fire, and also the torpedoes do quite a bit more damage. It's like, what, almost 17k per torpedo? Not nearly as fast, of course.
We destroyed an enemy battleship.
But yeah, I would have maybe gotten to do a bit more damage overall. Because these are still only the 10.7Ks you find on the Erland. They're not particularly damaging torpedoes at all. I'm pretty firmly winning at this point, though. I mean, it's 2 caps per piece. A piece? 2 caps per team. But we do seem to be basically driving them back. And I think my role in this one was rather less decisive than the previous one. I think I played a much more pivotal role with the capping I did in the previous one, and also killing the Des Moines, helping take out that Shimakaze. So this is going to be more damage, but by far a less decisive game. But it also showed off some stuff about the ship that I thought would be, you know, reinforcing what I'd already said. So here we are. This is me shooting a fully distracted Moskva. He's now basically alone. He could choose to shoot me, but he's going for the much closer target. And so I'm free to just keep trying to hit the superstructure. The shells aren't super duper accurate. I think the dispersion is exactly the same as the Lightning. And the 6 shells and the 4-second reload with BFT means that it's a decent damage output. It's not bad. It's just there are plenty of destroyers that you don't necessarily want to tangle with, even if you do have that heal. Especially other Royal Navy destroyers. I mean, not so much the Lightning itself, but the Jutland and the Daring. And of course, the 2 gunboat Japanese destroyers. I think a lot of the Soviet destroyers you might think twice about tangling with, and maybe even the other EU destroyers, just because they have the faster rate of fire. Talking of other EU destroyers, there's the Tier 10, the Haaland, though in this case rather more damaged than I am, so although they're taking off considerable chunks of my health, and you know, if this was a one-on-one I might end up rather lower health than this. Well, I've got the heal available, and I've also got a lot of allies shooting at them instead. I'm not even going to get the kill there, so yeah, that ends the game. So 63,000 this time, a couple more torpedo hits which account for most of that, and a decent amount of credits when obviously this was is with various economic flags. And again, top of the team. Rather less impressive this time, 1,850 versus the 2,300 plus it was last time. Like I said, I think I was rather less decisive, and I think I would have in any destroyer been able to do pretty much the same. I didn't really have to use the radar in this one, but I got to show off the torpedoes a bit, and that early kill on the Kid was quite nice to show off as well. Just giving some idea of what this can do when it's contesting a cap with a destroyer buddy. Although in this case it was just a random other player, but you know, we were able to very effectively take down that other destroyer, which probably had actually quite a decent impact on the outcome of the game, considering it was 50% of their destroyers gone, you know, right at the start. So before we wrap this up, we're going to have a little look at the port stats, and also to correct something I said earlier. I said it was basically a Lightning, and it is, but technically this is an M-class destroyer, whereas the Lightning is an L-class. But visually they are basically identical, apart from that 102mm gun where the second torpedo set is on the Lightning. And the M-class were essentially a repeat of the L-class. I think there were possibly some minor differences between them, but yeah, they are very similar looking ships. Now, the actual history of the ship itself, Orkan, I mean, it was launched as HMS Myrmidon and transferred to the Free Polish Navy in late 42 or late 43? I do actually have that written down somewhere. Late 42, and basically served in the Arctic and the Atlantic as a convoy escort up until it was sunk in 1943, mid-1943, by a German U-boat. So it had less than a year in Polish Navy service, and it was the greatest Polish Navy loss during World War II, because I think some of the crew were rescued, but quite a lot of them died. It was like 100 plus men and officers went down with the ship, unfortunately. Some were rescued by one of the other escorts. So, yeah, it had a rather short history with a sad end, but, you know, such is war. It is interesting to have another historical ship in the game, though, one that did actually see some action in World War II. Anyway, so, in terms of comparing it to ships, yeah, it's basically, you know, what if lightning, but these torpedoes and a radar. And while it does superficially have something in similar with the Cossack, I think the Cossack is rather a different beast overall, just because it's got the creeping smoke, and it's also got quite beefy firepower. You know, Cossack is first and foremost absolutely a gunboat, whereas Orkan is much more of an ambush predator. It's very much more of a specialised ship. Now, if I compare it to other Tier 8 premium destroyers, or at least the ones I've got, which I think most, if not all of them, I don't think I'm missing anything there, it pretty much stands on its own. There's not really much else like it in the game, apart from the Smerland at Tier 10, which does a pretty similar thing, except obviously that has much better AA, and I think the radar is roughly the similar, but it's got more capable guns than this. So yeah, if you've got the Smerland and fancy something similar, this does a very similar job. But in terms of everything else at this tier, I mean, yeah, there really isn't a lot like it at all. But I did have the thought that it would probably pair very well with a Low Yang, just because Low Yang has smoke. In fact, it's got US smoke, and it's got hydro. Plus, it doesn't have deep water torps, so it is also more effective against other destroyers in that regard as well. So, yeah, this does seem like it would be a very capable division ship. That's something I've not really had a chance to do with it, as I've said, but under those circumstances, it could actually do rather well. And even with something like the Kid or the Benson or any other ship with a fast rate of fire and decent smoke, it seems like it would be quite a capable addition, and it would be even more powerful in that cap contesting role than it is now. You do have to be careful about when and where you are contesting caps. So, I mean, you know, you can still be counter-radared, and if there's carriers in play, that's a huge factor as well. So having an Erland buddy to share AA with, for instance, might also be useful, except then, of course, you don't have any smoke between you, but you can have divisions of 3, of course, so that's also a possibility. But yeah, overall, it's nice to see a ship being added that has a niche, that is quite capable at that niche, and has some, you know, drawbacks that feel commensurate even to the advantages that it has, which is better than I can say for the Silivangi, which just feels all round fairly bad. So yeah, it's certainly better than that. I can definitely give it a higher mark of praise than the last Tier 8 Prem to come out. So that's it for my look at the Orkan. Hopefully you found this video useful, and if you did, you can do all the usual things down underneath it, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.